look at discrimination cases. So we handle complaints made by disabled people. We also raise awareness about various different aspects of the lives of disabled people and the issues that they face, which includes issues of poverty and debt advice, which is quite frequently we have emails sent to us with people asking for information about it. So overall, we are here to regulate the UN-CRPD, which is the Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disability, which the EU has signed up for. And what I'm going to speak to you about today is not necessarily the technicalities of debt advice, because that's not an area, although my background is as an accountant. My area of expertise in my current job is as a disabled person and as access for disabled people in all areas of life. So I will begin with a brief introduction about why it's important that disabled people are considered when you are thinking about the debt advice that you offer. Since the United Nations Convention was introduced, most countries in the world have actually signed up to it, and it covers all areas of life and all rights that disabled people should have to bring about equity, so that they have equal opportunities. And that has led over the last 10, 15 years to improved inclusion in society. Disabled people have gradually understood that they have rights and that they are able to exercise those rights. And as a result of that, they are becoming more independent, which is a good thing. There have also been increased levels of employment, as specifically in the EU, there has been a large recognition that disabled people need to be employed and need to be able to have an independent income. And as levels of income have increased, and as levels of employment of disabled people have increased, whilst they're still not up to the levels of non-disabled people, disabled people are finding themselves with more money and more opportunities. And as the different areas of the UNCLPD come into play, we can see that accessibility improves, access to transport improves, which means that disabled people are able to get about more and are more included in society. Because of that, and because more people have employment, access to finance is becoming increasingly important for disabled people. Access to finance is something that is a fairly new topic for disability. Previously, disabled people, and actually as a whole still, disabled people live in quite impoverished circumstances. The jobs that they have tend to be lower paid. They are often having to work part-time or on reduced hour contracts due to the impairments that they have. They also have additional costs to being disabled. There are very many costs that are associated with having an impairment. Accessible taxis generally cost more than taxis which are not accessible. The access to education, access to employment, all have additional costs that disabled people have, besides the costs that they have that are related to their own impairment and devices and things that they need in order to be able to live independently. So there are a lot of additional costs related to disability. Historically, disabled people's families have always borne the brunt of these additional costs. And that is probably still largely the case because disabled people, when they are employed, have lower wages. But with the improvement in employment, there is a need for disabled people to be able to get access to different financial products. And obviously the debt possibility for disabled people is much higher because of the additional costs that they face. In addition to this, it is actually incredibly difficult for disabled people to get loans because of their impairments. Access to all sorts of different loans can be very problematic, where life insurance may be required. And generally, banks are very loath to give finance to disabled people because they perceive that there will be problems in disabled people being able to pay back the loan. Accessible information is absolutely essential, and that comes not only from the financial provider's side, but also from the disabled sector side. It's really important that awareness is made that disabled people should be able to get access to debt advice and to be able to get financial products. And so it's very important not only that we raise awareness of the need for disabled people to be able to get hold of information, but also that the people who are giving debt advice and the financial providers are also able to provide information in ways that is accessible for disabled people. I'm going to go through some basic accessibility requirements. If you are giving advice to disabled people, they may be fairly obvious, but I think it's worth going into them. Accessibility to offices is quite often a huge problem because of the historic concept that people's finances when they are disabled are handled by their families. There has never really been seen to be a need for offices related to financial services to be accessible. And so the provision of ramps and signage and accessible toilets is very important, where if you are offering a service for disabled people to be able to come to get debt advice. Sign language interpretation might be a very frightening thing, but if you have somebody who is deaf, or hard of hearing, they will probably be able to bring their own sign language interpreter with them. So hopefully that won't cause too much intrepidation. What's important is that while you are speaking to the disabled person who is deaf, it's really essential that you look at the disabled person rather than the sign language interpreter, because you are trying to communicate with them, and the sign language interpreter is just an extension of the disabled person who is providing a communication aid. For people who are neurodiverse, especially people who have autism, having a quiet space in your office is very important. It's essential if you have a lot of noise in your office and you have a lot of background noise going on, that there is somewhere that is quiet with no distractions, so that people who have autism or who have anxiety when in busy places are able to concentrate on the advice that you are given. And also information that's displayed in the offices needs to be given in several different ways, which I will go into in a bit more detail later on. I'm going to concentrate first on accessible websites. There are Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is WCAG. At the moment, 2.1 is in play, but 2.2 is due to be released in Q3 2023. These guidelines, you can Google them and you will get dozens of checklists that will come up. And these provide information to developers of websites to make sure that the website design is accessible for disabled people. It's also important to recognize that the EU Accessibility Act also requires that public websites are made accessible for disabled people. It's much easier if you design a website from scratch according to the accessibility guidelines, but it's also possible to retrofit your website for accessibility. And these include very small things like contrast. For example, people with visual impairments, and this presentation is shown with black writing on a white background. It may be, if you have a visual impairment, that's very, very difficult to read, and you would prefer to see white writing on a black background. And there is some very easy coding that allows you to click on an icon so that you can change the contrast. The font size needs to be accessible as well, so there has to be something in the website coding that allows somebody to turn the text into a larger text or a smaller text. And the other thing that I've mentioned is graphics. When you put up pictures on your website, people with visual impairments use screen readers to access the information on the website. And if there is a picture of a person sitting at a desk talking to a debt advisor, then in the coding, there will be a description attached to that graphic which says this is a picture of a person receiving information from a debt advisor. And the screen reader in that case will be able to look at the information and hear the voiceover through their screen reader, so that they understand what's going on the page. It's also important that we provide accessible application forms. These take many different formats. In Malta, what we use are Google Forms, because Google Forms do tend to be very accessible. One of the things that you need to take into consideration here is that if you are doing a general application form, it's useful if you can ask a question about whether somebody needs assistance because of an impairment, such as an accessible PDF document or sign language interpretation, or an assistant to come with them when they're coming for the appointment. So these are things that are very important for you to be able to provide. And you will find that disabled people will be very, very happy to provide information about the assistance that they need if they are given the option on an application form. There are various forms of accessible documents. Braille was the original format that people with visual impairments used. It's a series of dots, raised dots on a page. I'm sure you are aware of that. And it is possible to find people who can print in, Braille printers do exist. In Malta, we have only a few people who read Braille and only a few people who can print in Braille. But over the rest of Europe, Braille is used quite extensively. And so it's worth having something in Braille in order to be able to offer to people with visual impairments if they need it. Because most people now who have visual impairments are using screen readers, to provide something in a PDF format or a Word format which is accessible to a screen reader is also very, very important. And if you are inviting somebody to an office in order to be able to give debt advice, then it is worth asking at the outset whether they would need the information beforehand, because it may well be, if they don't bring a laptop with them, that they would like to be able to read the information you are providing in advance so that they can prepare with their own accessible equipment at home before they come to the office. Leaflets are very useful and should be given in large format whenever possible. And what I'm going to go on to look at is easy to read formats. Easy to read formats are documents that are provided for people who have intellectual disability. There is an incorrect perception that people with intellectual disability are unable to understand complex information. This is not the case. At CRPD here, we have provided easy to read versions of all of our disability legislation. So our Equal Opportunities Act has been provided in easy to read. The United Nations Convention, which has 52 articles in total, is also available in an accessible, easy to read format. So because the information that you are providing may be deemed to be difficult to understand, you shouldn't assume that people with intellectual disability wouldn't be able to understand it. What is required is that disabled people are given the option to be able to look at something in an easy to read format so that they understand in a much more easy way how that can work. So the first thing to do when you are looking at to create an easy to read document is look at the length of your document. Long, complex documents are very difficult for people who have intellectual impairments, and also people who have problems with concentration, who may have ADHD or anxiety issues. Having a long, complex document can be quite traumatic if they feel that they really need to understand it and that it's very important to them. So what we do is we look through the document, we make a list of all of the really important people, all of the important points that are related in the document, so that we can reduce it to very simple and very clear key points. For the Equal Opportunities Act, we managed to reduce an act which was, I think, 80 pages long down to about 15. And that may still seem like a lot of pages, but actually the number of pictures on the page and the points per page are very well spaced out to allow for easy understanding. And as a result, it's much less traumatic for a disabled person to be able to go through it. Use of pictures is absolutely essential. If you can find a clip art picture or a photo and you can put some small sentences next to it, this is an ideal way to provide easy to read documentation. People will understand a short sentence or a few bullet points with the use of a picture a lot easier than they would if there was no picture at all. Having just words makes it quite difficult for people with different impairments to actually understand. So it's very important that pictures are used throughout the document. If you can get a picture for every bullet point that you are making, then it will be very, very easy for disabled people, especially with intellectual impairments, to read. The inclusion of definitions is important. Obviously, in finance, there are lots of complex words, and it's important that you, if you are using these complex words, that you also include a short sentence saying what you actually mean by it. Obviously, these can be explained when you are giving the advice in person, but the use of definitions in the document is useful for disabled people to use as a reference point, even when they go home. Again, it's very important that this sort of information can be provided before an appointment if you are inviting somebody to your office to give debt advice. It's also very useful if you can have the document that you have produced proofread by a person with intellectual impairment. Here at CRPD, I only have one employee who has an intellectual impairment, and I also have a couple of people who have anxiety issues and autism, and all of them will look at the documents that we have produced that in an easy to read format to make sure that they understand them, because quite often, even with our years of experience, we will slip up. We will ask the person to explain what they think it means and ask questions to us so that we can speak to them about what the content of the document is. And that's actually very important. I have here an easy-to-read link. Inclusion Europe is European-wide network, and they have some very good information about putting easy-to-read documentations together. This is something that they specialize in. In addition to that, if you require assistance in putting easy-to-read documentations together or getting them reviewed, then we have in Malta a disability equality training team. This is a team of disabled people. We have somebody with an intellectual disability, somebody with a visual impairment, we have somebody who is deaf, we have somebody with autism, we have somebody with a spinal injury, and somebody with a mobility impairment. And they provide training both in person and online in all aspects of disability awareness and equality training. And talking about easy to read documentation is something that they do quite often to a lot of people. In fact, last month for our adult learning organization in Malta, we provided a training session purely on easy to read documentation, and we did workshops where they were given a task or a paragraph from a piece of legislation and asked to put it into easy to read. And then we had the lady from our team with intellectual disability judged them all and told them where they had gone wrong and what was easy for her to understand and what wasn't. And if you would like us to look at your documentation or give training on how you can do it, then we would be very happy to help. And that's more or less all I have to say. I don't know if you have any questions. I have some contacts here if you want to get in touch with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.